unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan and When Ideas Matter, Democracy and Corruption in India is the title of a new book by the author Bilal Baloch. The book provides a framework for understanding how governments respond to credibility crises. We all know that governments act in their own interests, but what are those interests? How are they defined? And where do they come from? These are the questions that Bilal explores in his new book through an examination of two seminal crises in Indian history: Indira Gandhi's response to the JP movement in the mid-1970s that led to the imposition of the emergency, and the UPA government's reaction to the India Against Corruption movement a decade ago. To talk more about his work and its relevance to Indian politics today, Bilal joins me on Zoom from Washington, D.C. Bilal, congrats on the book and good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. And also, thank you for helping me name the book, Milan.
I will gladly take credit. It is a great book and great cover and great title, if I do say so myself. Let me take you back to the origins of the book. So, full disclosure, we were in touch from the early stages of this book. And I know that you were in India in 2012. Mm-hmm. You saw firsthand these anti-corruption protests that, occupied the streets of Delhi. And they were protesting these sort of eye-popping, allegations of graft and corruption against the incumbent, which was the Congress-led UPA government. Take us back to that moment, if you would, almost exactly a decade ago. What was the scene like in Delhi when you were there, and how did that, set off that chain reaction of events that led to the book?
Yeah. So I think it's worth going back even a little bit before 2012 to 2011. I was at grad school at the Fletcher School. And, when you're at grad school, and especially when you're studying international politics, the world around you takes on completely different meaning. What you're studying in class, you start to look for patterns and ideas and thoughts in the world that's changing around you. And many of you will remember that this was the time when the Arab Spring sprung up onto the scene, and there was a lot of talk about the deepening of democracy in the Middle East and ground-up movements that were, going to change traditional historical power structures. And so it's really against that milieu that, then going to India for a summer with friends during 2012 and seeing the India Against Corruption movement really bloom, not just in Delhi, but in cities across India, it really felt like this was not just an Indian moment, but a global movement of a particular demographic of young, tech-savvy, politically engaged people coming up and saying enough is enough, whether that was against autocratic government or corrupt government or, policies and politics that had kept segments of society out. And really, it was a call for more transparency and a cleaner style of public policy. So what I saw, going back to your original question, was really a real cross-section of people, mainly young students and young people from college campuses, but also an older guard, journalists, civic activists, really a cross-section of society that really was turning around and saying, no more.
And when did you figure out that, this was the thing that you were going to devote, the next several years of your life to study, right? I mean, was it sort of an immediate thing that, I have to get to the bottom of why this is going on? What was the kind of eureka moment?
So these things are never really planned for anyone out there that's gone and done a PhD, or quite frankly, even in my current life as running a startup, you're constantly pivoting. And it certainly was enough to get me interested in this new question about emerging democracies, developing democracies, and why they were facing this challenge around the world. And at first, I was mainly just interested in the entire phenomena of corruption, and specifically, when and why does it become salient? Why were these protesters Why were these individuals rising up against corruption at this particular time? So when I started the PhD and in conversation with people such as yourself and others, that seemed like the most interesting question. And I think to a large extent it still is. But as I started to investigate it deeper and started to look closely at these movements, there was actually a more proximate puzzle that was essentially, well, these governments are also responding quite differently to these protests, right? Some were crushing these movements while also claiming to be democratic orders. Others were co-opting them, yet others were engaging in negotiated concessions. So I became a lot more interested in the responses to these movements and, looking around at the literature, looking around at what people were studying when it came to uh, the phenomena of corruption in developing countries. I felt there wasn't enough being said about the variation in these responses, especially because the reasons for these responses was being assumed away, right? Such that the focus was purely on, well, the protests matter and how these protests come about. Governments will always look to crush protests that they come up against. But I didn't think the story was as simple as that.
And so, you kind of note at the outset that in political science, there is a standard view of politics, right? And politics is essentially seen as a contest among competing figures. They have clear and stable interests. They develop strategies to pursue those interests. And that's kind of the whole story. You offer a very different view, right? You offer a vision of politics that is a struggle for power and a struggle for control among decision makers, but they're motivated first and foremost by ideas, right? And so ideas are distinct from and actually kind of analytically prior to interests. So what are the traditional accounts kind of missing in your view, right? What was it that really you saw was the gap that others hadn't quite put their finger on?
Yeah, look, before I give you that answer, I think it's worth pointing out that I'm heavily influenced by those same works, right? And they've ended up shining a lot of light on not just political behavior in India, but around the world for us, right? Why do politicians distribute electoral seats to malfeasant but wealthy politicians? When do governments institute meaningful reform when there are threats to their bribes for election financing? Why do some governments instigate violence as a means to hold on to the spoils of office? All these works have told us a lot about political behavior in India and beyond. But I felt that they were focused, and the assumptions undergirding these arguments were not rooted in a social ontology, but an economic one. And what that really means is, how much of the way in which leaders, politicians, decision makers, how much of how they are being conceptualized and theorized was looking at changing worldviews and changing ideas and their agency as leaders, as opposed to just external material interests that are a stimuli or can compel these leaders to act one way or another. And I just wanted to really build an argument that started off by saying, hang on a second, these decision makers have a lot more agency than we assume. That was the sort of initial half-baked hypothesis, which thankfully ended up finding quite a bit of evidence in the work that I produced.
So let me ask you about the sort of crisis conditions, right? Because your book focuses on how governments respond to anti-corruption movements at a time of what you call credibility crises. And how do we know a credibility crisis when we see one? Like, what are some of the characteristics of elements, right? Because you talked about uncertainty, disequilibria, sort of what does that mean on the ground?
So the reason I couch it in terms of a credibility crisis and government's response to these credibility crises is because when I started looking at these anti-corruption movements and anti-corruption protests and the very phenomena of corruption and when it becomes salient and when it doesn't, it was very obvious to me that the literature certainly, but also the way in which we experience corruption was not putting forward a clear-cut story, right? There's enough work out there that talks about the exposure and revelations of corruption lead citizens to vote out governments, as there is that the exposure of corruption, and specifically of corruption engaged in by specific leaders, can sometimes be a badge of honor and end up providing more support for that particular political order or leader. So I think that looking at corruption in an isolated way wasn't fulfilling both what I was looking at, which is the emergence of these anti-corruption movements and how governments respond to them, but also in the research that I was doing and in the interviews I was conducting, how decision makers were talking about corruption. They weren't. It was not always in terms of malfeasance and the ethical digressions or what have you. It was always in terms of a much broader set of crises. That's how corruption was being experienced by certainly decision makers and political elites, and I would argue even citizens. So the way in which I think about a credibility crisis is that it's a part of a much broader set of pressures resulting from a culmination of domestic and international pressures, whether that's oil shocks, inflation spiking, a GDP growth slowdown. It could be an exogenous shock of conflicts arising regionally, and collective action on the street calling for a set of malfeasant politicians or corrupt government ends up being a part of that, because the way in which decision makers are conceptualized is that had it not been for their unethical and non-transparent rule, these broader crises would not have emerged. And I think that's also how I present it in the book, as to how decision makers also see these anti-corruption protests. They see it in terms of a broader set of economic and political pressures that end up pushing state elites to act one way or another.
So in the book, you focus on these two specific cases, right? So the first one is the JP movement, Jay Prakash Narayan, his leadership of the opposition, which led to, pretty massive protests against the then Indira Gandhi government. She then, of course, reacts with the sort of no holds barred decision to proclaim a national emergency. Many of our listeners will know what happens next. And then, on the other hand, there's the more recent story of the UPA government's much more measured response, where they did initiate a series of negotiated concessions with the India Against Corruption movement. I want to start with the Indira Gandhi example because, many analysts, if you kind of go back and read the history, portray her as being, this very kind of cynical, opportunistic leader, not especially motivated by any particular ideological framework. But your book has a very different take, right? I mean, you talk about how certain principles, namely socialism, secularism, protection of minority rights, these were absolutely essential to understanding her decision to crack down on the opposition movements in the mid-1970s. And I'm wondering if you could just help unpack for us, how did those ideas come to play out in how she responded to this domestic, credibility crisis, as you put it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, I think it's worth pointing out that the established view on the emergency and the sort of more dominant views are as straightforward as Mrs. Gandhi was an authoritarian style leader. She had undisputed power over her party, and her party was synonymous with the state, and therefore she was able to use the might of the state to crush her opposition because they presented an existential threat to her and her control. And I think by and large that's not too far from the truth, right? But I think it doesn't go far enough, and I think it misses some of the important causal subtleties of how political reactions work. And so what I present in the book is a theory that says there is an interaction between the state and especially power structures within the state and the worldviews and the ideas of decision makers and groups of decision makers that have authoritative power over public policy. And so, whereas the first part is pretty well established in the work on the emergency and Mrs. Gandhi, it's the second piece that I'm really trying to emphasize and highlight in the book that I think gets relegated. And therein, it's not so much that Mrs. Gandhi was an ideologue in an intellectual sense. So I point out that her party was dominated by ideas of socialism, secularism, and a focus on the protection of minority rights. And to suggest that is not to say that Mrs. Gandhi was a staunch socialist. In fact, I think there's very thin evidence to suggest that she was. But I think her imagination was certainly captured by these ideas, and more proximately, that her closest advisors in B.N. Huxar and Mohan Kumar Mangalam, among others, were staunch advocates and architects of a strong state sector and a socialist political economy. Now, how does that then play out for her and this government when it's faced with the Jayaprakash Narayan movement? Well, I talk in the book about this concept of cognitive locking. And cognitive locking, I think, is best summed up by thinking about it in terms of how the ideas around you and your organization, your organizational culture or zeitgeist, if you will, once it commits to certain ideas and certain policies, can lock you into behaviors consistent with those set of ideas that can shape subsequent action. So, to make it not so abstract, the Jayaprakash Narayan movement was absolutely a threat to Mrs. Gandhi and the Congress's power by virtue of the fact that these were sets of protests in Gujarat, in Bihar, and ultimately at the national level that were advancing the corrupt state narrative and eventually asking for the complete removal of Mrs. Gandhi from office, especially after the Allahabad judgment where she was indicted for corrupt campaign practices. But also, from the other side, looking at it from the government's perspective, how did they view the JP movement? And there, the sequencing of events is very important. And that's why at the start I said, the nuances that political sequencing afford are what we need to focus on. And there's a very clear timeline that I outline in the book where the JP movement ends up mobilizing quite visibly and concretely with the RSS. And once that mobilization happens, the JP movement goes from a political opposition on the street that needs to be dodged and contained and co-opted to a movement that needs to be crushed. And that delta is what I think is better explained when looking at the interaction between the power structures and the strong state argument that prevails and the one around ideas that I talk about, because there is clear evidence that the Indira Gandhi government and her close advisors, chief among them people like S.S. Ray, were building a blueprint for what is essentially what turned out to be the emergency against the Jayaprakash Narayan movement as early as January 1975. And their justification and rationale for it is firmly rooted in the RSS's mobilization with the Jayaprakash Narayan movement. So to sum up, I think on the one hand, there is an interpretation of this to say, well, that's a justification of convenience. Sure. But the other, and I think the more powerful argument, especially when looked at comparatively with the UPA case and when looked at against the very rich body of evidence that I present, is that these ideas were swirling in the Congress Party and in the upper echelons of the Congress Party and shaping their public policy program for several years. And that's where tracing the exogeneity of these ideas and the fact that they existed far, far before the emergency decree shows that the Congress Party and the leadership specifically were locked into responding to the Jayaprakash Narayan movement in a antagonistic, illiberal way from the moment the RSS became visibly involved in it.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, if we fast forward several decades, you have a different Congress government hit by another very different credibility crisis in the form of the sort of large-scale disquiet over corruption you described at the start of this conversation. And it was sort of punctuated or crystallized by the India Against Corruption movement that gave birth to Arvind Kejriwal, the Aam Aadmi Party, and a number of other people who are kind of, prominent in India today. You mentioned that the UPA government, perhaps unlike during Mrs. Gandhi's time, had significant internal divisions, and that those divisions, in a sense, can help explain how it ultimately decided to respond to this corruption protest. Elaborate a little bit for us, if you could, on kind of what those divisions were, who were in the different kind of buckets or categories, people, and what were they advocating?
Yeah. So again, returning back to the argument of the book, this interaction between power and ideas, right? And once again, the prevailing view of the UPA has been that there were divisions of power within the UPA leadership, specifically between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Congress Party President Sonia Gandhi. And those divisions alone explain what famously became referenced as policy paralysis and an inability to really do much or of anything. But that argument alone doesn't explain moments where those divisions still existed, but policy still worked or government still performed. And it doesn't explain, once again, the sequencing of events that happens when a government is facing off with a protest movement, where there can be twists and turns, pivots, and what explains those twists, turns, and pivots and different strategies. And that's where you have to bring ideas in. And so with regards to the UPA, I outline two sets of divisions. One is the prevailing argument that's known, that there was a division of power between the objective power of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He was the prime minister. That's the position he held, elected official to oversee the executive branch or within the Indian system and preside over the main decision-making apparatus in the country through the PMO. But the subjective power remained with the Congress Party and its chief, Sonia Gandhi. And both Mrs. Gandhi, in this case, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, and Manmohan Singh ended up concretizing this division through the institutions that they presided over. With Manmohan Singh, that was the cabinet and the prime minister's office. And with Sonia Gandhi, that was the NAC. And the NAC ended up becoming a counterweight to the cabinet and the prime minister's office on public policy, not just formulation, but execution throughout the UPA government. And those are power divisions and power cleavages that I think need to be deepened by looking at also a second set of divisions within the UPA government, and that is that of ideas. And that's where I look at individual politicians and individual technocrats. And it clearly emerges that there's really three ideational camps, as it were, that emerge. One what I reference as market liberals. And I say that not to say that, decision makers that had a dominant market liberal worldview can be reduced solely down to that, but that was the main prism through which they were able to look at public policy challenges and prescription. A second group were social reformists, and these were people more in a sort of Keynesian tradition that were within the NAC around Mrs. Gandhi, had been former bureaucrats, former social activists. And the third camp were secular nationalists in the Congress Party tradition. And so these three dominant ideational camps interacting with the division of power between Prime Minister Singh and the cabinet and the PMO on the one hand, and Sonia Gandhi and the NAC and the Congress Party on the other, when it worked well, were able to ensure that there was a clear dialectic and dialogue on public policy that was being formulated by that government, enshrined within how they functioned with also their coalition partners. But when it didn't work, and when ideas burst open, when they were faced with a crisis and under uncertainty conditions, that's when you started to see these ideas start to check and balance one another. And that's why what is popularly referred to as policy paralysis, I reference as a checks and balance mechanism playing out.
So, just to follow up on one of these critical actors, you talk about the NAC, the National Advisory Council, right? And this was a kind of body of advisors that were not formally a part of government. It was this kind of extra governmental arm, but were very influential.
That's right, yeah.
And they had a big influence both in terms of the UPA government's overall scheme of what it sought to do, as well as the specific response to this corruption movement. And I'm just wondering if we can think about the Modi government for a second. It hasn't quite suffered the same sort of credibility crisis yet. But given the role that the RSS plays, I'm wondering if you see analogies here, right? Because we tend to think of the Modi government as kind of the singular entity where you have a domineering prime minister who kind of runs everything. But is that really the case?
That's a very good question, and I've got a few ideas on this. But I think it's worth first pointing out that Sonia Gandhi crafted the NAC, and the balance of power between her and them was very clear, right? They were almost like hired hands that she brought in as her own private think tank or parallel cabinet, depending on how you want to look at it. Whereas I think the ground up historical and social resonance of the RSS, especially in the fundamental creation of the BJP, renders the RSS far more powerful than Prime Minister Modi. So I think that's first worth pointing out. But then it begs the question about is that always functioning in a singular way? In other words, are there divisions of ideas and views within the RSS that Prime Minister Modi has to come up against, or that can balance him, just like we saw in the UPA government as a whole? And I think there's some evidence for that, right? Let's think about some of the foreign relations moves, right? Not all members of the RSS and its affiliate organizations shared the Prime Minister's view on FDI, right? The Swadeshi Jagran Manch, which is an economic affiliate of the RSS, vehemently opposed liberal FDI norms. And the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, also an RSS affiliate, contended that the economic reforms, the liberal economic reforms, had led to jobless growth. Yet that hasn't stopped Prime Minister Modi's government from pursuing trade deals abroad, in trying to privatize certain industries, or fueling growth in line with, quite frankly, not too dissimilarly to how market liberals in the UPA government did. So I think those divisions certainly exist. Will they be able to check Prime Minister Modi or not? I actually think that's the more interesting question than even what tends to get bandied about, when will the Congress emerge again, and what kind of political opposition can come back and balance out the BJP. I actually think it's far more interesting to look at what divisions, ideological and otherwise, can come up within the BJP umbrella, including the RSS, that could play either a checks and balance mechanism, or, quite frankly, even lead to a division of the party and the organization as a whole.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, Bilal, because I was on one of these panel discussions about the recent state assembly elections, and this question came up about, well, what is it that the government wants to do? Because, now they have a renewed mandate, and they are going to have a dominant position in the upper house, and they control these large number of states. And the fact of the matter is, I think the most interesting debate is happening on the BJP side internally, right? It's like if you go back to the days when we talked about the Congress system, right? We talked about the factions within the Congress that were vying for supremacy, right? You had conservatives, you had, more socialist oriented leaders, you had people who were more of the Hindu traditionalist vein, you had the more secular minded politicians. And that, in some sense, is, I think, where we should be looking at the BJP. Of course, it's a bit more complicated, the BJP, because it's not just the party apparatus as such, but all of these other affiliates where there is a kind of push and pull. I remember at the beginning of the Modi government, when it came into power in 2014, a lot of people said, well, what's the balance of power between the RSS and Modi? And the joke was, well, there is none, because Modi is the RSS. And I actually think that's not accurate. I think there is a lot more internal negotiation than we might otherwise admit.
Yeah, and I haven't gone out there and interviewed RSS leaders. Not even sure how well that would go down, but I've certainly read some of the works of a lot of our colleagues on this, and it does seem to me that there are sufficient sort of ideological divisions, but also strategic divisions. Would the RSS want any prime minister, any politically elected leader, to end up becoming synonymous with it? I don't think so. So even if I think there was a world in which there was ideological coherence, the unabashed power piece of this and the balance of power piece of this, I think, is also important. And they have to go hand in hand. I'm not sure they would want Prime Minister Modi to have sort of undisputed control over the direction of how the RSS as an organization evolves.
Just really quickly before we kind of move on to our last set of questions, it struck me while reading your book that your framework has a lot to offer, even as we think about trying to understand India's response to the Ukraine crisis, right? Because it's not a credibility crisis as you define it, but certainly India has come under a lot of international, some domestic criticism for its decision not to come out and outright condemn the Russian invasion. And, many Indians have been writing on the op-ed pages on social media saying, look, we defend India's position. It's acting out of self-interest. But it seems to me that ideas also have a role to play here, right, in explaining how the country conceives of those interests.
Yeah, personally, I think India has actually played its hand quite well, but we can get into that if we have time. In terms of the ideas, I actually think there's a very coherent policy strategy match here, right? There's been a lot of talk over the last several years, especially under Foreign Minister Jaishankar, around strategic autonomy. And that seems to be the guiding principle of India's foreign relations today. And I think it's a bit unfair to just say strategic autonomy is old wine in new bottles, right? That it's just non-alignment redefined. because the way in which strategic autonomy can play out in today's geopolitical realm is completely different. India can have close relationships with multiple partners and exploit cleavages in the international order. And it can look for power to be widely distributed where no single country or group of countries or core institutions has a total grip on international cooperation. We've seen a flurry of high-level foreign dignitaries and officials visiting India just in the last couple of weeks from Russia, the US, China soon, Japan. They're all going to New Delhi to compel it or convince it to hear them out. That wasn't happening during the non-alignment period. And so I think the worldview or the ideas that undergird strategic autonomy, that India wants to function in a multipolar world, not be close to the US, but prevent it from becoming globally preponderant, and sort of maintain this milieu in which the international order can have multiple actors where cleavages may emerge that can provide competitive advantage. I think that sort of strategic autonomy that Foreign Minister Jaishankar talks about, we're seeing it play out right now. And it may actually, incidentally, present India with an opportunity to actually end up having a greater role to play in de-escalating this particular crisis. But there's a lot more variables and factors at play there before something like that happens.
Okay, this is a very interesting segue to another conversation that you and I should have at some point and maybe record for posterity, because I think you've opened up a very interesting line of argument. But in the interest of time, let me pivot to my last stop, which is something that has nothing to do with the book, which is you are kind of opening up a new chapter of your life as the kind of scholar turned entrepreneur. You are the COO of a successful startup. So really quickly, just tell us kind of what are you doing now and what's the story?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So I'm the co-founder and COO of a company called Inquire AI. And Inquire is quite simply building software that enables organizations to get connected to experts either around the world or within their own organizations, and receive diverse, curated knowledge that can help decision makers with their investments or their business decisions, operational or otherwise. And it's a really exciting period to be doing this. I think, misinformation and fake news have become such a permanent part of our zeitgeist, and to work on a platform that is trying to do really three things. One, deliver curated information from subject matter experts where you can trace who the subject matter expert is and what they're saying to you, both using AI tools, but also quite simply by being able to have transparency over who's delivered a piece of content right to you. Secondly, connecting businesses to actual experts on the ground. I think for far too long, businesses and organizations as a whole have turned to those of us who are lucky to, ply our trade in a DC or a London or a New York, but we end up getting a disproportionate amount of airtime, as it were, than our counterparts who are on the ground, be it in an India or Pakistan or in Brazil or Turkey or what have you. So that's the second piece, is that, bringing subject matter experts where they are directly to decision makers. And the third piece is to do this in a way that lends itself to future collaboration. So, one of our goals is to make sure that not only are subject matter experts able to deliver what they know to clients that are willing to pay for it and make better decisions as a result of it, but to build those relationships between experts and decision makers that can then continue on. And overall, my vision is that at a net level, we're trying to ensure that better, more trusted, and higher quality information is reaching decision makers who are, making pretty significant plays with regards to investments around the world, product development around the world, and even civic actions as well.
So I don't know how you do it, and also raise 2 children at home, but congratulations. I know that you and Inquire have successfully closed another round of funding, so best of luck to you.
Thank you.
The book is called When Ideas Matter, Democracy and Corruption in India. It is absolutely essential reading if you are in the camp of people who think that ideas matter, that ideology matters, but doesn't get enough airtime. And then if you're not in that camp, I think you might find some of your priors challenged by reading this book. Bilal, thank you so much for taking the time with all you have going on, and congrats again.
Thank you, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.